The book of Ecclesiastes is shaped by the book of Genesis. And we can't really understand what's going on, what the author of Ecclesiastes is doing, unless we understand the book of Genesis and also what the author is doing with the book of Genesis, okay? So in this video, I want to look at the way the author of Ecclesiastes uses the book of Genesis to shape what he's doing. So he uses a literary device called allusion, which is where he refers to a previous work, something that the readers, the audience would pick up on, right? So for example, an allusion that's common if you're a millennial, hopefully you watched Lady and the Tramp, right? And so now, whenever you see two people or things with a piece of spaghetti in between them, you think of the Lady and the Tramp. Like, you can't not think of it. It gets shot forward to the front of your mind, right? It's forced up there because of our cultural understanding and our cultural experience of watching Lady and the Tramp. So Ecclesiastes, that's an allusion. So Ecclesiastes is doing that. He is using allusions to the book of Genesis to force the book of Genesis to the front of the readers and hearers or listeners' minds. And if we miss that, I think we miss what's going on in Ecclesiastes. He does this in several ways. First is the Garden of Eden. If you read the book of Ecclesiastes, right there in the second chapter, chapter 2, when he's talking about building gardens and parks and navigating it with waters and using all of these, planting in it fruit trees of every kind, he's using language that is taken directly from the book of Genesis because he wants us to start thinking the book of Genesis. He wants us to think about Genesis as we read Ecclesiastes. And so he's setting this picture forward saying, look, I did this thing that's a lot like what God did back in the Garden of Eden. And the way I'm going to do that, the way I'm going to show you that is I'm going to use the same language, the same figures of speech, the same words, the same verbs, the same nouns, because I want you to think about the Garden of Eden. And so when Ecclesiastes talks about this park or this garden that he puts all these fruit trees and everything in, he's wanting us to think through the book of Genesis. The second way he does it is through a reference to death in Genesis, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You know in Genesis 3 where the author says, God says, look, because you've done this, because you've sinned against me, you're now going to die, right? You're going to return to the dust. You were created from dust, and you're going to return to dust. Now, Ecclesiastes uses almost the exact same phrase to say that in two different places, that humans are going to return to dust, right? That when we die, we go back to dust. And the author of Ecclesiastes, refers back to Genesis again, because he's wanting us to think about what's going on in the book of Genesis. So when Ecclesiastes talks about death, he does it in a way that brings Genesis to the forefront of our minds. Another way he does it is in talking about joy. So repeatedly throughout the book, Ecclesiastes has something called the carpe diem passages, or seize the day, or the joy passages, where he says, look, he lists several things. Look, and calls them God's gifts. You need to enjoy food, you need to enjoy work, you need to enjoy your spouse, and you need to enjoy wine, unless you're a Southern Baptist, in which case you need to enjoy unfermented grape juice. That's just a joke for the Southern Baptist guys out there. So he lists these four things. He says, these are the four things God has given us. These are the four things we should enjoy. And I'll talk later about how all that relates to what it means to walk with God now. But he lists these four things that are present in the Garden of Eden. When God created Adam and Eve, he placed them in the garden to work. He placed them there with each other. He gave them all the food that they could eat. And we can only assume that he also gave them wine to drink, right? The fruit of the vine, right? And so in Genesis, God places people in this garden. I don't know if you can hear my dogs barking, but my kids are outside right now, and so my dogs think they're dying, but they're not dying. They're just inside while my kids are riding bikes. So anyway, with adult supervision, even though I'm in here. So Ecclesiastes lists these four things: food, work, women, and wine. Food, work, spouse, and wine. To say, look, this is what you should enjoy. This is exactly what God gave Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and this is what you should enjoy now, these good gifts that God has given us, if it's in your power to enjoy that. And we'll talk about the enjoyment aspect later and what it means to be able to enjoy those things. So, death, the garden imagery in Ecclesiastes, the enjoyment passages in Ecclesiastes, and then finally, this key word Hevel or able. It's typically translated as vanity or meaningless. I'm sure you've heard vanity of vanities or meaningless, utterly meaningless. That is the exact same word as able in Genesis 4, right? And able is the first example of the upside down nature of the world, right? Cain is wicked, Abel is righteous, and yet Abel dies a young death and Cain goes on to live a long time. And we'll unpack that a little bit later in another video on Abel and the meaning of Hevel in Ecclesiastes. But for now, just note that this word appears 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It appears something like 73 times in the rest of the Bible. So over half are in, if my math is right, over half are in the book of Ecclesiastes. And he's using this word as a marker, a pointer, an allusion back to the book of Genesis, right? And so as we read the book of Ecclesiastes, we have to keep in mind the book of Genesis and what's going on there. That's going to help us understand what the passages that talk about Hevel are meaningless. It's going to give us a framework for understanding those passages. And when we talk about fearing God, and when we talk about enjoying the gifts of God, and even when we talk about this garden imagery, we need to have Genesis in mind. And so the author of Ecclesiastes wrote his book in a really engaging way, in an artful way, to help us understand that he is using Genesis to talk about what's going on in the rest of the world, okay? What's going on in his world today. So, yeah, essentially, we should read Ecclesiastes as a commentary on the book of Genesis, where we have the original intent for God's people and the breakdown of that intent, and then the world turned upside down with the Cain and Abel narrative. And that's what Ecclesiastes is all about. How we live in this world, how we get back to the original intent in Eden, and then if we're not able to do that, and we're ultimately not until Christ comes, how to mimic that as best as possible, right? With enjoying these gifts that God has given, with taking pleasure in food, in work, in a spouse, and in wine. And I will talk about all of those later on too, and how we attempt to return to the Garden of Eden, and in the process how we deal with the upside down nature of the world in which we live. And so we have to keep in mind Genesis through all of this, and the author of Ecclesiastes wants to make sure we keep it in mind, and so he uses these allusions over and over throughout the book so that we're constantly referring back to the book of Genesis as we read Ecclesiastes. If you have any questions, please let me know. Put them in the comments below. Please subscribe if you're interested in Old Testament. That's what we talk about here on this channel.